Hello, thanks for joining me. I'm going to be doing a short demonstration on 3 ways for handling asynchronous code in JavaScript. I'll be using Node, but all of this will work in a browser as well. So if you're going to follow along, make sure you have Node installed as well as VS Code. That's the text editor I will be using. So I'm going to go ahead and make a new folder here. We're going to call it Async JS, and then I'm going to open that in VS Code by right-clicking on it and choosing Open with Code. I'm using a Windows 10 PC for this, so I have that context menu that you'll see. You probably don't have that if you're on a Mac. So let's go ahead and make a file called index.js. And the most typical way of dealing with asynchronous code is by using a callback function. So a callback function is just simply we take a function like setTimeout, for instance, which takes a callback or handler and then a timeout, right, the number of milliseconds to wait. And so any code that needs to wait to be called back needs to go inside a function, which will be called back by the code that from setTimeout when the specified time has elapsed. So let's go ahead and wait for 1,000 milliseconds, which is 1 second. And we'll go ahead and console.log hello world. Let's go ahead and capitalize the H and put an exclamation point. So here, the first part is our callback function. Second part is the amount of time to wait. And so this is one way to deal with asynchronous code, is to again, wrap the code that needs to happen after some period of time or some event has occurred. So in our case, we're waiting for 1,000 seconds to elapse. So we need to wrap all our code that we want to do in a function and pass it to setTimeout. And this is what we call a callback. Let's go ahead and test this code out. I'm going to go ahead and open the terminal in VS Code. I'm using Git Bash for Windows as my default terminal. So yours might look different from mine. So I'm going to go ahead and run node index.js here. Only had a typo. Let's try that again. Node index.js. Let's run our code. We wait a second, and there's hello world. All right, so essentially we're passing 2 parameters. We have a callback function, so I'm going to go ahead and just kind of separate this out and give it we'll assign it to a value. We'll say const greet is the function that we would like to run after a period of time. So we can pass our greet, and we want to wait 1,000 milliseconds. And we'll just make sure that code runs as well. Run it again. Wait a second, and there it is. So that's the first way. Now the second way is to use a promise. So before I show how to use a promise, let's look at how you can create your own promises in JavaScript. Now a lot of popular libraries will implement promises. If you're working in the browser with the Fetch API, it natively uses the promise interface, which you might recognize with .then and .catch calls after your initial call to a function that returns a promise. So before we look at that, let's look at how we can take setTimeout and make a function that behaves the same but uses the promise interface instead of taking in a callback. So here we're going to define a function called const wait, and then it's going to be a function that we can call which will return a new promise. So if you want to make a promise, you need to use the new keyword and then call the promise constructor function. And that constructor function takes 1 argument, which is a function. And that function is going to be passed 2 values. A function which should be called after the asynchronous work is finished. You can optionally pass a parameter or an argument to that function. And then a reject function. So basically, when resolve is called, that's what triggers the promise interface, the .then. So I'll talk a little bit more about that in just a second. And then reject is what is used when you want to indicate that the code has failed. So here I'm going to call setTimeout. And we're going to go ahead and call. And here, our wait function needs to be, we need to go ahead and pass it a time to wait. So that's going to be timeout. And then after our time has passed, we're going to call our resolve function, basically saying that the asynchronous work is done, go ahead and do whatever comes next. So set timeout is going to call this resolve function, and then we want to pass in the timeout so we can determine how much time to wait. Now, in our case, there's really no error that's going to occur here. I mean, I suppose if timeout wasn't a valid number, that might trigger an error. So why don't we just go ahead and do that? Let's go ahead and do a try catch block. So that way, if there's an error, such as an invalid timeout, then we can reject. And then here we would want to pass the error object to our reject callback. So that's how you can create a new promise, right? Take some asynchronous code that maybe uses a callback, and when that asynchronous code completes, call this resolve function, which is what will happen after the timeout period. And then if anything goes wrong, call the reject function to indicate that something has gone wrong and the promise failed, but it's done with its work. So now let's take a look at how we can use this wait function. So I'm going to call wait and pass it our 1000 millisecond wait. And now that it's a promise, this is where promises come in. We can chain a call to this .then on the end of a promise. So now that this returns a promise objects have a number of methods. The most common ones you'll see is this .then and .catch function, which can also be called. .then will happen when the promise successfully completes and calls resolve. So here I can pass my greet function. So once the promise is resolved, then we'll run greet to say hello world. We can go ahead and delete our call to set timeout here. And then catches if something went wrong. So here we can run an error, and we'll just console.log the error, like so. So that's what the promise interface looks like. Again, basically, what was our callback passed to, let's go ahead and actually bring back our call to set timeout. Greet 1000, we'll just comment it out. So previously, this call to set timeout ran greet as our callback function. The only thing that's really changed here is now I'm calling wait .then call greet, right? And then .catch will only be called. This function right here only happens if something goes wrong anywhere in our promise, anywhere in the promise here. If reject gets called instead of greet being called, our code's going to jump down to this .catch function. So let's go ahead and test this code out. And oops, I forgot to comment out our first greet call. Go ahead and comment that out. Let's try it one more time. And there we go. See, hello world. So that's using promises. Okay, so another way to use a promise is using the async await syntax. Now, in newer versions of Node, I'm not sure if they're released quite yet, you'll be able to use async await right in the global scope of a module, but typically to use the async await syntax, the code needs to be inside of a function. So we're going to wrap up everything in a function just called main. And then inside of main, we're going to use async await syntax. Now, in order to use async await, you need to add the keyword in front of the function. So here I'm going to say async function main. This can also be used with arrow functions. So I could say const main equals async and then write an arrow function. Both of these are valid ways to create an async function. Now, what I can do here now that async has been called, or the async keyword is indicated in front of the function, it means that I can await anything that returns a promise. So now I can do this. I can await my wait function like so. So we'll wait for 1000 milliseconds. And then I can call my greet function like so. So this is going to work same as before. Oops, helps if I call main. So this is what async await looks like. So we call it async await because you use the async keyword in front of the function. Works for either function declarations, function expressions, and arrow functions. All of them can use this syntax. And then with that keyword, what can happen is you can use this await keyword in front of anything that produces, in front of any promise. And calling wait returns a promise, so I can await it. And this basically is going to halt execution asynchronously, so other code can run in the meanwhile, right? I can say console.log not waiting to print this line, and so it's not going to freeze execution. This whole function is going to run asynchronously now, and my callback, what was my callback before, now just comes after I've awaited. So let's go ahead and run this, run node index, and we can see first came not waiting to print this line, followed by hello world. So we know that it didn't freeze execution. Node was able to continue running console.log after calling main, and then when the promise for wait resolved, greet was called. So those are the three different syntaxes for working with asynchronous code. We saw the classic callback pattern, which has been around since JavaScript has been around. And then a little more recently, promises were added to the specification for ECMAScript and have been implemented in most major browsers as well as Node. And even more recently, the async await syntax, which is just sits on top of promises. Basically, is just another way of dealing with promises. So instead of chaining calls to .then and .catch, we can use async await, and that just makes the code read a little more like synchronous code while still being asynchronous. Now, that's certainly not all there is to know about working with promises and async await, but that'll get you started and help you understand how this syntax works. So thanks for watching.